And I want to welcome you. It's such a privilege to welcome you to our very first LearnX Seminar. For those of you who are just getting to know us, the Graduate Network catalyzes communities and systems around the aspirations and goals of individuals, and more specifically, those adults with some college who have not yet earned their degree. In the collective movement, we do that in the collective movement toward full education and economic equity. And for those of you I have not yet had the pleasure of meeting, I'm Sally Glickman, co-founder of the network and currently privileged to be serving as the interim CEO. I just mentioned this is our first LearnX seminar, and we design these to be specifically focused on national issues that require collective action to address and solve. Our big issue today, and perhaps the biggest one faced by a healthy chunk of the estimated 36 million adults with some college who have not yet earned a degree, is the astoundingly awful practices that hold transcripts hostage against prior student debt, ensuring that debt can never be repaid or recouped, and often sentencing the former student to a life on the economic margins. To guide us through this issue, we have a fabulous panel here with us today and a great audience. I was so excited to see all of you who pledged to come today. And I hope that you will engage actively with us during the discussion. Please post your questions in the chat, which will be monitored by our very own Kathy Zandona. Kathy, you can wave to everybody. And to get us started, Zach Zimmerman, who's the producer of today's event, is going to launch a poll. Just to calibrate, we want to know how often in your experience, so prior debt combined with transcript release is an issue that delays or prevents adults from returning to college. Not all of you may be able to answer this, but for those who can, please do. So while you're responding to that, please join me in welcoming Julie Seltzner to our virtual stage. Julie is Senior Director of Adult Programs for College Now Greater Cleveland, which, among many other things, among many other great work, helps adults with some college or no degree navigate back to college. So welcome, Julie. And Zach is going to post a link to Julie's programs, and I hope you'll all grab it and take a look at it later. So Julie, let's start with this. While our audience is completed, or they're almost completed the poll, what's your response to this question?
I answered often to the poll. Definitely not everybody, but it sure seems like a lot of people who are affected by this in our direct service work.
So it's pretty good evidence that there's a systemic problem here, right? I mean, you know, when you see occasional sometimes, but when you start to see often or always, you know that it's not about individuals, it's really about systems. So tell us what you did about that.
Well, so the evolution of even getting to understand how broad the problem was. So we probably, like a lot of you, we see adults all the time, you know, they come to us from various referrals and so forth. But when it came to like kind of critical mass was when we started getting lists of students who had stopped out from university, our partner university, so that we got like 3,000 people and they did not screen them for any financial holds. So then when we were contacting these people, it was just over and over and over and over. They definitely had the desire and aspiration, but they had this institutional debt holding them back. So that's how it became kind of like, hey, it really came to my attention that this was a consistent problem.
Great, great. And I just realized that I probably saw the poll results and we didn't post them, did we? Did we post them, Zach? There we go. So I was looking right at them as a co-host and realized nobody else actually saw them. So as you can see, you were 65% of our attendees say that this is often. Only 12 or 30% say sometimes. A couple always. So two are always confronting this, but we have 0 as never. So we know it's a pretty big issue, just to affirm that. So now that you've all seen what I saw, we can get rid of that, Zach. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, hold on. Let me get it off of my screen. So what came next for you? Tell me a little bit about the, sort of the journey that you went on as a community leader.
So I was trying to think back which conference I was at. Remember conferences, everybody? And there was conversations about it was like some Ohio Department of Higher Education people. That's our governing body in Ohio over the public institutions, about this issue. And they were, like had some level of awareness about it. But there was some policy folks from Lumina that were presenting. So it was just a session I was in, and they talked about just generally all, both federal and state policy, but then they spoke about this existence of this grant that you could apply for to study something in policy in your state. It's called Strategy Labs. I'm not even sure if it's still around anymore. But so I asked the guys, like, how about like withholding and collection of institutional debt? Does that fall into policy? And he's like, yeah, it does. So I just went home and looked it up, and it's a really, really easy application. You can max it out. It was a $25,000 grant max. And I talked to my Policy Matters friend, who was not Pete at the time, but his predecessor, and said, hey, would you be interested in this work? So they were, and so we applied, got it, and contracted with Policy Matters to study the depths and breadth of this problem. As we, like anecdotally, it seemed to be everywhere, and I didn't really understand how bad it was. So the original goal with Policy Matters was to find out, like, how many people were affected by it, how much money, and we really wanted demographics because, as you probably all know, Lumina's and all of us are focused on equity, and we figured that this was an issue that affected minority and low-income students more than others. So anyways, that launched it, and that was what led to the report, and then kind of snowballed from there. I just want to say that, for the direct service providers, I had no idea what I was doing at all. So it's been really interesting because this report, I didn't realize like that you do this report, and then there's a communication plan, and you try and get publicity. It's a whole media thing. I had no idea that existed. So I've really seen the power of like what you can do, because, I thought you just put it on a shelf and then you have it. So it's been very interesting path.
Well, it's cool. And we're actually going to chart that a bit today. And so I'm super interested. I know what we're going to do now is bring on Pete Van Leer. And so Pete, he's the senior, as Julie mentioned, is the senior researcher at Policy Matters. And I personally love this. And he describes himself as an advocate for equitable access to higher education. So I feel like everybody that's with us on LearnX today is never getting rid of the Graduate Network, because you all care about what we care about. And I think in the chat, Zach has just dropped in, or will be dropping in, some links, including to Policy Matters, but also directly to the report that Julie was referencing. So before we get to the Ohio findings specifically, I want to ask you both, and Julie, I'll start with you. What was the most surprising or shocking thing that you discovered as you started to dig a little deeper into the general issue of transcript release and institutional debt?
The most shocking thing was the number of dollars that are tied up and the number of people who are affected. And we were also talking somewhere in this with Malia and Juana's coworker, Laura, because she was studying this too. And we were both, we're kind of anxiously awaiting to see what these numbers were. And I can actually remember her gasping when she's like, that much money. And it's so funny because every time I try and reference it, I always drop a few zeros. You're going to see the chart in a minute, but it's, over $700 million that people owe in Ohio alone from this one. I mean, it's just, it's stunning. So that was incredible.
Yeah, it's really, it's when you take it down to the human level, right? The individuals, right? These are numbers that are so big that they're mind-boggling. And when you take it to the individual, and I know that every day you and your team and so many people on this call are working directly with the individuals who are impacted and caught up in this vortex that that just really, well, we'll talk a little bit about disproportionate impacts in a minute, but I really want to bring Pete on. Welcome. Thank you, Pete, for being here.
Thank you, Sally. Thanks for having me on.
So just to follow on, so what was your big shocking moment?
Well, I would say the most revealing, at least, if not entirely surprising, were the racial disparities that we found. You know, since they don't, we can talk about this more in a minute, but since they don't collect demographic data, we used a proxy and found, you know, that we compared the community colleges with the four-year universities and found that the two-year schools have twice the number of accounts with the AG, even though they're more affordable. And if you think about it, it makes sense because they're enrolling a lot more low-income students, students of color, first-generation students, older students who don't have the same money or the family experience with higher education. But it's just really, you know, here are the students who most need help and assistance to get through to whether it's a certificate or a degree or what have you, and they're just not getting it. This is just a barrier. So that, you know, that's a pretty big finding, I thought.
It is. Before I let you go, Julie, just to contextualize a little bit, Ohio, like many states, has a degree goal, right? Is that correct? Do you just want to talk a little bit about that, and maybe Pete, you can both just however you want to handle it in our totally unscripted moment. Just tell us a little bit about the Ohio goal.
Yes, so Ohio's educational attainment goal is to have 65% of adults with a credential or degree by, Pete, 2025?
2025.
Okay.
2025, which seemed like such a long way off in 2018 and 17 when everybody set these goals. And so it's really in that context, right? And that's going to be important because for, I think, almost every state, we don't have this as a poll question, but my guess is almost every state has some similar sort of goal related to that. And so that creates a good backdrop to be discussing that. So I'm going to let you go for a second, Julie, so you don't have to be on main stage and you can take a sip of coffee or whatever gets you through the afternoon while Pete and I chat a little bit about his report, Collecting Against the Future. And I, you know, in case you're wondering about the flavor of all this, which you shouldn't be given what Pete just shared, right on the front cover, it says student debt practices undermine Ohio's higher education goals. So I'd like you, while we're talking, to please post your questions in chat. We really want this to be interactive and to make sure that we get to your content, not just ours. But Pete, I wanted to start by just level setting because debt can be confusing. And there's, as I understand it, there's an institutional debt and loan debt. Could you just unpack the difference for us?
Right. So, I mean, I think this audience probably gets it more than many, but we often go into these conversations and people don't understand there's student loan debt, which is not debt to, for the most part, to universities, to schools. It's really the federal debt, like to third party or the federal government. Whereas this is institutional debt, and it's owed directly to the institutions, to the schools. It could be anything from parking tickets, library fines, on up to, you know, room and board, tuition. It's a whole range of things. So it's a real key difference. And I think that's something we try to make clear as we go into this work.
So I think what I find very compelling about this, and actually want to really look at the connection between institutional debt and then transcript withholding is sort of the next question. But it would seem to me this is not, if people have images or policymakers have images, this isn't somebody who showed up for class, took a class on the college's dime, and then walked away, right? I mean, their tuition is oftentimes paid. It's these other sort of last dollar sorts of things that tend to drive up, like your lab fees, for example, or things not covered.
Any number of things, but it's a wide range, and it's definitely not people who are trying to cheat the schools. people could stop out, after the drop deadline or something and end up not realizing that they do owe money, or it could be the room and board piece where if they pull out. We've talked to a lot of students, who've told their stories, who've been really willing to tell their stories, and just like things happen that in people's lives that they don't have control over, and all of a sudden, months later they realize, or even years later, they realize that there's this debt hanging over their heads, or they're trying to go back to school, and that leads to that issue of where's the so many institutions have that policy. If you owe us money, we're not going to give you the transcript or let you re-enroll, and I think that just gets people stuck. So that's really those issues that people ask us about debt, and then they ask us about transcript withholding, but they're so intertwined that there's a link there, because it's not a state policy necessarily, but the institutions around Ohio and around the country almost invariably have that policy, and it's just there. That's the way we do things.
Right. And then of course there's this misunderstood notion that college is a free ride if you get a Pell Grant. Is that fair?
I suppose. I mean, it's clearly not true, but yeah, I mean, it's certainly an important assistance for a lot of students who really need it. It's probably not enough for the most part, not even at the two-year schools that are more affordable.
Right. So tell us a little bit about Ohio law, because it is interesting and a bit of and a bit different than some other states, which we'll get into in a little bit.
So Ohio law requires all public colleges and universities to turn their debt over to the Attorney General's office, State Attorney General's office, for collection. And what's interesting, I mean, that alone is interesting and somewhat unusual around the country, as we'll talk about later, but there's a deadline. So it has to be turned over, certified to the AG within 45 days of when the debt is incurred, or 10 days after the start of the next term. So it's a very, in state laws, it's written, a very hard deadline as to when this has to happen. So that, that's, obviously pretty quick for the students. They might not even realize that they have this debt. And it's also means that the universities, the colleges, don't have a lot of flexibility, at least as the law is written. And there's other aspects of it. The universities might add some fees, some fines or interest to that amount, the original debt amount, and then when it gets to the Attorney General, they will add collection, they will add interest and fees that they're charging. And then on top of that, as they farm it out, so there's a period of time from, I think it's 170 days, where the AD keeps it and tries to collect. And then they farm it out to a third-party debt collector for I think 270 days. And then if that's not successful, it goes to another debt collector, a third-party collector. And each of them adds fees and fines and interest. And then it goes to special counsel, where lawyers will then try to sue people for the money, and they'll withhold state income tax returns, things like that. And so it's a very punitive, harsh system, very unforgiving system. And once the debt is with the AG, it's harder to get it back, and it really limits flexibility and opportunity for the students and for the schools themselves. And the other piece that's worth mentioning is that it stays with the Attorney General for 40 years. So you can imagine, you've been out of school, or you dropped out of school, stopped out of school 30 years ago, and all of a sudden there have been stories about that have been in the media coverage. 30 years later, you're getting this, you realize you owe this school $2,000 or whatever it might be. And, it just sticks with you. It does not go away that easily. And so it's a real barrier. It really keeps people from getting the education they need. And the collections it's not a very effective system.
No, it does not sound that way. Now, I'm a visual learner, and I know you've got some top line findings. Julie talked about the shock factor. So we'll do that a little bit on visual. So I'm going to step aside, and if you could just quickly run us through your top line findings.
Sure. Yeah. So this is we got data from the Attorney General. That was where we asked for the data, just the central source, and they had it broken down by all the universities and colleges, and we put that all together And you can see here in the third column, the total number of accounts cumulative over the years, over 40 years, is 390,000. This was November of 2019, so it's actually continued to grow. HCM, I think, or no, it wasn't HCM. Somebody else did some looking into it, and it has grown since then, of course, even during the pandemic. So that's how many accounts there are, almost 400,000 accounts. The total value of all those accounts, all that student debt, was more than $735 million. And every year they collect in the range of $50 million. You can see that column under collections. And so over the past 5 years, over those 5 years, those 5 fiscal years, they collected about $260 million, right? Which might sound like a lot, but it's really only every year they collect about 7% of the total. So, you know, that's not a great return. And if you think about what a large university might get back, it's not really giving them a whole lot. And that debt is just sitting there and, you know, keeping people stuck. Certifications per student each year is about the same. You can see that last column, you know, based on the enrollment, it's roughly the same. Hasn't fluctuated a lot. So,
Okay.
And you have another slide, right?
Yep, you have another, well, you have another slide.
I have another slide. Yeah, so this was, I referred to this before, because we couldn't get demographic data from the AG, we broke it, we used the 2 years versus the 4 years as sort of a proxy, because as you can see in Ohio, you know, the 2 years old enroll much higher percentages of students of color, part-time students, older students, you know, 25 and above, first-gen students. And so you can see there in the final column, accounts per students, the 2 years have almost double the number of accounts. So of those 390,000, you know, even though the amounts might be lower for the 2 years in terms of what they owe, the actual number of accounts per student enrolled is really quite a lot higher. So that means the students attending the more affordable schools who are more likely to be Black, part-time, older, first-gen, they're really getting hit the hardest by this. More of them are affected by this. And another piece that's not, I mentioned at the bottom, the second bullet here, that Central State University is Ohio's only public HBCU, and they're also, you know, disparately impacted by this. That's a school that enrolls about 90% of its population is Black, and their average value per account of debt, the debt account that's with the AG, was $4,500, close to double what the average value per account at other four-year schools is, which was about $2,900. Yeah. So, you know, that just shows you again, you know, this is a more affordable school, which is geared toward Black students, many first-gen students, really high percentage of first-gen students. And their, you know, their debt load with the AG is significantly higher than that most students at, you know, other four-year schools. So that, I think, is, you know, again, very revealing, very important to keep that front and center, that this is having this disparate impact on Black students, in particular, students of color. And also, you mentioned this before, adult students. I mean, look at the older students are more likely to be going to two-year schools. And this is really a big issue for them, because oftentimes they've stopped out. They kind of maybe started studying and then they stopped, and now they owe debt, they can't go back. And in Ohio, as elsewhere, you know, the trends are that we're getting fewer and fewer high school graduates, you know, recent high school grads going right to school. That demographic is shrinking. So if we want the state to meet the goals of better educated workforce and better educated residents, Ohioans, we really need to look at how do we remove the barriers for everybody, but in particular adult learners. And that, I think Julie in College Now work a lot with those learners. So I think that's another really important top line piece of information.
I appreciate that a lot. I think that why don't we take this this down. We got a question in the chat from Kylie. Thank you very much, by the way, about where this legislation comes from. And I'm calling it out so all of our panelists can think about that, because I'd like to use that to kick off our broader discussion. So Kylie, thank you for that. Thank you for that question. I think it's a great and important one that we'll get to. So Pete, I'd ask you to think about that to the extent that you know, but I'd like to now sort of pull back the lens. So this is Ohio, and one of the very cool things about your research is that it inspired some very interesting follow-on work. And so Zach is going to drop a link in the chat to one such study by Ithaca SNR, which actually Julie brought to our attention. And I think it's very interesting because it looks at national norms around this. So this is an Ohio issue, but it's a national issue as well. And most of us don't have the opportunity to live in Ohio. So we might be interested about what it sort of means for the rest of the country. And Zach is actually going to drop a link into our poll. One of the things that Ithaca SNR found, based on heavily pulling from Pete's report, is that the unpaid balance that resulted in stranded credits, so that means sort of the institutional debt, was $2,300. And for those of you who can answer that, we're just curious about level setting. In your experience, how does that level of debt compare to what you experience? Is it about that? Is it lower? Is it higher? And we'll just take us a few minutes. We'll take a few minutes to do that. Pete's going to leave, but he isn't going far. Both he and Julie will be back soon for our discussion. But in the meantime, we certainly have more to talk about. So for those of you who, so Pete, thank you very much. For those of you who read our light bulb, and if you don't, you should, that's our Graduate Network newsletter. You might have read about HCM strategies and their groundbreaking work inspired by Ohio on state and system level institutional policies. We were very excited about this work. We knew from Julie it was coming. And I am delighted to introduce two of the report's authors to discuss what they learned. So if we can bring on Malia Sieve is the director, and Juana Sanchez is the senior associate at HCM Strategies who did this research, worked on this report. There isn't a lot of time to tell you more about them or to share all the reasons that we are privileged that they're with us today, including the fact that Juana and I have like 1 degree of separation, it turns out. But their collective expertise on understanding this issue is just amazing. I'm so thrilled that we've got it. And I promise you're going to be very excited about what they are going to show us. So without further ado, please post your questions in the chat. And I promise that I didn't forget about the poll. We'll see the results soon. I'm going to turn the floor over to Malia and Juana and step aside. Thank you.
Wow, well, thank you so much, Sally. I don't think I've ever had such an exciting introduction ever. So it's a pleasure to be here. I love the energy. And I'm pretty sure that Juana has only about 1 degree of separation from just about everybody in the country lately. So I'm very privileged and honored to get to work with Juana. You know, I wanted to touch on a couple things that have been said. Sally, you mentioned about, you know, are there, you know, how many states actually have goals? And at the peak, we had 46 states that had statewide attainment, educational attainment goals. And then to circle this up with the question mark of, does Strategy Lab still exist? It does. It's alive and well. And HCM actually also is the organization that helps Lumina to manage Strategy Labs. So I actually have spent the past 7 years actually working with states to try to help them in developing those attainment goals. So circling that up with this research and its impact on actually inhibiting people's ability to achieve their goals, and as individuals and as states, I've really enjoyed diving into this as a very tangible thing that folks can start to work on to just meet those individuals and state level goals. Well, so then let's talk about how did we even get into this? So HCM, if you want to advance to the next slide, we actually, as Julie mentioned, we're sort of simultaneously coming to this place with Ohio. We were working with Ohio Cradle to Career Network on identifying some real issues that were keeping individuals from achieving their goals. And this item came up in those discussions at the same time that Policy Matters was also interested in doing this deeper dive into that. So it was all in Ohio. So our research was born, our 50-state analysis was born out of this interest that Ohio had in being able to compare itself to policies or similar policies in states across the country. If you want to go to the next slide, I'm not going to talk in depth about these next two slides, only to just further underscore some of what Pete has already shared with you. So he talked with you about the numbers of accounts, the levels of debt. We just wanted to highlight here, right, that just in 2019 alone, right, that their attorney general's office held 390 million accounts of over $735 million. That number just strikes us so deeply. And that the average amount was $1,500. And I think that for some folks, it might feel like that should be manageable, but it's not, right? I mean, this is something that is keeping folks from being able to go back. And when you think about sort of that cost to students, you're talking about not just that cost, but you're also talking about their ability to then go on and achieve the credential that they're seeking in order to earn that paycheck that will help to them and their own social mobility. So it's not just this number, but it's beyond that. This last point, of course, Pete did a fantastic job at underscoring just the disproportionality of the impact on students of color and those in community colleges and HBCUs. On the next slide, this really just articulates these first few bullets around the compounding of how that $1,500 becomes even more than that from just the financial perspective right there. And to put a finer point on this, right, so between 2015 and 19, it resulted in $50 million in past due debts and fees collected by the state. An even finer point, I love that Juana pulled this up for me to share, which is that Ohio State University certified just over $60 million in past due accounts and to the AGO over 40 years. That's the course of which that 60 million was certified. But if they actually collected all of that in one single year, it still would be less than 1% of its $7.5 billion annual budget. So just to, like I said, put a finer point on, really a finer point on the question of who's really benefiting from this, and how much do we really need to be paying attention to sort of that bottom line. If we go to the next slide. So we're going to, let me turn to sort of this national research, right, and the work that we did. So as I mentioned, there was the interest in comparing Ohio's work policies to the other 50 states. So the work that we did was to look at first, whether or not a state had a state level policy. And just to be super clear, we only looked at state level policies. We did not look at institution level policies because we know that institutions, many of them are creating their own policies on how to work with students or have barriers with students. And that was really more of the focus of the Ithaca S&R report. But our focus was on state level policies. We just looked at publicly available information, whether that was legislation or system level policy. We looked at the requirements for the institutions to refer the debt to outside entities, like the AGO or others. We also looked at whether or not they stipulated anything around the minimum amount of debt that needed to be referred to collection, and also if there was any mention of a minimum amount of time before debts should be referred to outside entities. So with that, let's go to the next slide for a map to show a bit of what we then found. So this map lays out the following. Let me start with the gray pieces. The gray states are those places where we actually could not find whether there was any state or system level policy governing such practices, which means that it's basically just left to institutions to determine how they want to handle this institutional debt. The orange boxes, and I will tell you I'm a little colorblind, so maybe my orange looks a little different to you, but I'm going with orange. Orange is the states that have, where they have to refer their that debt to a tax intercept program or an offset program. So what that means, for those that are not familiar, is basically that debt then at some point in the process gets referred to your equivalent of a Department of Revenue that then gets to basically attach that debt to any sort of tax collection that the state has on you. So it will intercept any money you get in a tax return before you then ever see it. So that's all of those orange states. And then the yellowish, beige kind of states, those are states that have to be referred to an attorney general's office as as one of the first cuts. And so you can see Ohio is one of them. It's one of 5 states in which that is the case. Just to quantify the others, 27 states that are in that orange category and 20 states in the gray category. I should mention too that there is the overlap in Ohio and Virginia, whereby they both have the tax intercept program along with the Attorney General's office. So it's just sort of this compounding of one barrier on top of another for students in order to allow them to continue their education or access their transcripts and move on with their lives and meet that earning potential that they were seeking in the first place. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Juana to get to probably more interesting information in terms of some of what's actually happening in those states. Juana?
Thanks, Malia, for that overview. I'm going to try to just walk us through kind of layer deeper on some of the findings to highlight some of the differences, because I think what was really striking to us is that there really is a patchwork of state policies out there. And as Malia referenced, there are many states where there's just state law is quiet on these issues altogether. So first here, what we've pulled for you is a snapshot of the states that do have policies most similar to Ohio. So I don't have Ohio on this slide since we know Pete led with kind of a description of that. But again, we'll see differences here in states like Louisiana, New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, 4 other states that do require that institutions formally refer past due student accounts or institutional debt to their AGO offices. And what you'll notice first in some of this underlined and italicized text is that in some cases, states are really requiring and they are more prescriptive in what institutions must do, whereas other states like New York or Pennsylvania have more flexibility written into their law, giving institutions this as a course of option, but not requiring them to do so. You'll also notice some differences in terms of timeline. How long is it that institutions have to hold on to debt and try to collect on debt locally, coming up with their own strategies for communicating with students versus having to send it over to the state? So we, again, saw some variances here from 31 days in New York to 60 days in Louisiana, 90 days in Virginia. And then also some states are actually specifying like a minimum threshold of debt for which this course of action is reserved. And so in some states like New York, debt should only be turned over to the AGO if it is greater than $500, which feels like a little bit of a low bar, knowing that in some cases, the average debt amount is higher. It's $1,500 in Ohio, or it sounded like $2,300 in the case of that National Ithaca report. And so again, you'll see some variance here. If we can go to the next slide. And these variances, I would say, are also common in other states that maybe were not foreseen or asking institutions to refer debt to the Attorney General's office specifically. So Malia already talked about what are tax intercept and offset programs. I'm not going to belabor that. But I should just point out that in some cases, institutions are referring debt to other external agencies, usually a third-party collection agencies. So there are some cases where states will outline when, again, minimum thresholds for when an institution should be referring debt out, and then minimum timeframes. And I think top line, what we were just seeing was that, again, the conditions in Ohio written into their state policy did feel a bit more, perhaps we can say, aggressive compared to some of these other states. Next slide. Now, beyond the state policies, dealing specifically with past due student accounts or institutional debt, we started to see this emerging trend, which I know is of a huge interest to this group, and that is transcript withholding. We know, and we kept hearing from the field anecdotally, that transcript withholding is a very common practice. An institution might see this as leverage, as their way to actually succeed in getting the student to come back and pay their past due debt. So in fact, in a recent NACUBO survey, 98% of their institutional respondents indicated that they use transcript withholding as a debt collections tactic. And we were hearing institutions say, well, we have to do that. We are obligated. And we actually consulted a report here done by Rebecca Maurer, which is referenced here in the footnote. And she found that there is really no federal law, there's no federal precedence that requires institutions to withhold institutional debt. So it seems like at one point the federal government was actually recommending transcript withholding in cases where students were defaulting on federal loans, but that was not at all related to institutional debt. So it seems that those issues have been really conflated in the field. The Ithaca S&R report and our report both highlighted the emerging trend now where states, rather than just being silent on this issue, are actually taking this up through their legislatures. So we noted 3 such cases. I'll just highlight California for us, since that one seems to go really the furthest. And interestingly, in California, this legislation that was passed in 2019 took effect January 2020, was actually sponsored by the state attorney general's office. And so in this case in California, any California institution, public or private, is now prevented from withholding transcripts to a student on the basis of that student having an unpaid balance. They are still able, the institution is still able to charge their usual nominal transcript release fee, but they cannot set other conditions like repaying a minimum amount on a balance in order for that transcript to be released. Louisiana and Washington are 2 other states that have passed similar styles of laws, although you will see that they have different approaches and I would say have a more limited reach in terms of stipulating what an institution must do. And if we go to the next slide, I think this is really showing us that there is a shifting current. State policymakers are starting to pay more attention to what might be the unintended impacts of these types of institutional practices in terms of discouraging students from returning or adding barriers to their ability to complete a college credential. And so policymakers at the state level are really trying to think about, is this really what we intend to do? Might we actually need to speak up on an issue like transcript withholding, especially if a state has an attainment goal and is really invested in meeting that attainment goal for their, kind of workforce and economic agendas. So we've also noticed that parallel to that movement, debt forgiveness models are really cropping up across the country. I know Julie and Pete have talked about models in Ohio that have come up. Warrior Way Back has really been seen as one of the early innovators in the space that has inspired many similar approaches at institutions and in regions across the country. But we did come across 2 examples of statewide models that we wanted to flag for the group here. And those are coming out of Minnesota and out of Missouri. And what's interesting about these approaches is they really work with a statewide agency, so the Office of Higher Education in Minnesota, and a scholarship foundation in Missouri's case, to provide scholarship funds that students can actually apply on a semester by semester basis to pay down their debt as they are re-enrolling and successfully persisting through higher education. So one thing that I think is hopeful or bright spot about these models is that, again, states are recognizing that they might actually have more to gain by helping students return and by providing small dollar scholarships to address those relatively low balances that right now are keeping students out of college. And I'll just flag as one point here that in some of these models, like Warrior Way Back in Detroit, institutions are actually seeing that they stand to benefit. It's not just students that stand to benefit, but institutions are actually, if you will, making their money back as they are re-enrolling students and generating a net positive tuition revenue. So those students returning can actually help institutions grow their budgets in the form of new tuition revenue. So lastly, on the final slide here, we just wanted to put out some questions for the group's consideration and questions that you might pose to other stakeholders in your community, other state policymakers that you might be interacting with. I know for many of us engaged in direct service, it may feel a little bit hard to enter into kind of policy or policy advocacy conversations. But these are really, I think, targeted questions you could point your representatives to. And so I'm not going to read through all of these, but really starting with trying to understand what is your landscape in your state? What are the practices underway at your institutions? I think many of you are at institutions or working very closely with institutions. And are there unintended consequences? Who is being harmed? And is anyone really benefiting from this? If it's not the student, if it's not the institution, if it's not the state, what is the rationale for keeping these policies as is?
Right.
So on that note, I'll transition it back to you, Sally.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful. This work is so deep. It's so complex, and you guys are going to come back shortly. But there's one last piece of the equation, and we do have so much discussion, rich discussion, and I appreciate the conversations that or the questions that you've posted, and I would like you to do this, but we have to get, to the point of Juana's questions, right? So there's this last piece, like who asked the question? How do you activate around the question? And so I'm going to do 2 things. First, I'm going to ask Zach to do 2 things. I'm going to ask him to bring on Tom Lasley to the screen to have a last conversation about this before we move into our discussion, and also to post the results of our way back when poll. Do you remember? Right. So here we've got most of about a third of debt. So here's the deal. So Tom is so you might have remembered in one of our slides earlier, Learn to Earn Dayton was one of the partners in the Ohio network. And Tom is the former CEO, actually the retired CEO emeritus of Learn to Earn Dayton. And he's also, I learned, this is totally cool, the current good cop to Pete Van Leer, right? So he's the guy who makes it happen. So Tom, so welcome you to the stage. You know the data. You appreciate the scope of the issue. Now, all of us here appreciate the scope of the issue. It feels like a heck of a post-retirement challenge. Why did you choose to take this on?
Well, as you indicated earlier, Ohio has set a very aggressive goal for itself around educational attainment. And having sat through a number of the discussions, it became apparent to myself as well as others that Ohio's ambitious goal was also not achievable.
Right.
It was not achievable because we had too many policies and practices in place that mitigated the ability of the state to really allow students to complete credentials or degrees. And we know, for example, through the work of researchers such as Raj Chetty, that there are some higher ed institutions that do an incredible job with access and success. And Chetty and John Friedman have done an incredible job of documenting that. But it's interesting that some of those institutions that have that track record of helping young people become economically mobile are also institutions that are frequently penalized the most in terms of the way in which the debt of their student has to be certified to the state. So essentially, I became interested in this issue. It's certainly not the area that I was trained in, but I became interested because of the focus on attainment and the policies and practices in the state of Ohio that worked against that attainment goal. And the debt issue is clearly one of those issues. And I tell people, in fact, Pete and I were on a call this morning. One of the things I tell people is this is not really a Republican issue, or this is not really a Democratic issue. You know, I think with debt forgiveness, a lot of people kind of put all of this in the Democratic basket, and yet it's not really a Republican or Democratic issue. Workforce capital, human capital is in the best interest of the state, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent. And so that's how I came to this, is how do you push that needle, and how do you try to identify problems of practice or policy that are working against a positive movement of the needle.
Yeah. Wow, I appreciate that. I mean, I jokingly called you good cop to Peter. So I think just more, just perhaps you can sort of more descriptively share some of the things that you've been doing to approach this challenge, right? Because everybody is sort of confronted with these policies in their states.
So I think a couple of different things. So one, and the good cop, bad cop is I think a bit apt. I think if you're going to really attack this, you need groups like Pete, like the work that Pete does, that really is really pushing and prodding and creating discomfort around current practices. You also need persons, I think, like myself, who have reasonably good relationships with legislators and policymakers, so that you can try to find ways to navigate the ideas, a lot of the ideas that that Policy Matters puts forward, but you can navigate those in a way that that is perhaps not as possible for a Pete to do. And that's unfair in many ways, but I think there's a nuancing to this. To anyone who's done public policy work, they understand that you need different people in different roles doing different things, and that's how you begin to move the needle. Just two things. One thing, a couple things that have really made a difference. One, working with Pete, we've tried to get some of the students whose stories, whose voices around the debt that they've incurred, we want policymakers to hear those voices, to understand those stories. And so I've worked with Pete to arrange times for those students to connect with the legislators, and not do so in a formal hearing, because if you have formal hearings, at the State House, they often don't work, either because the persons providing the testimony are nervous, or because they feel a little bit more confined because of just the context. So we've arranged for them to have informal sessions with legislators, so that legislators can hear their stories, understand the angst that goes along with the debt that they've incurred, and the way in which that's working against their ability to achieve their life goals. So that's one thing. A second thing is for me to have conversations with a number of different parties, including some of the parties who do not want the policies changed. So we have people in the state who do not want this to change, at least on the surface, they don't want it to change. But you still have to engage in conversations with those persons. And you have to understand what their perspectives are. There was a question posted earlier around how did we get to where we're at? What's the history? Well, there's usually some sort of strange logic with any public policy. I mean, we can question the logic, but if you go back and you exegete it, you can kind of see, I get how they went from point A to point B. And so I think one of the things that's very important in this process is for those of us who are trying to affect change with public policy, is that we appreciate the voices of those who want to make the change, as well as the people who have reticence about not wanting to make it. And that's that balancing act. That's the good cop part of this, is trying to navigate that.
And I so appreciate that when we because, and actually we're going to get to that in the conversation. I want to start bringing back our panelists so that we can launch into a discussion. And I want to start with Julie and Pete, because when we spoke beforehand, you talked a little bit, we've talked about the potency, and I've seen this in other spaces, of the trifecta of practice, research, and policy. And so you, Tom, are the certainly the policy side of it. Julie is the practice side of it, and of course Pete, the research side of it. And together that sort of is a great advocacy framework. So I just wanted to talk very briefly, because there's a lot of rich questions that I'm seeing posted in the chat, so we want to get to those. But I'd like you to just, maybe the three of you, very briefly touch on where you've seen, you know, where you're starting to see the needle move, and what each of you, the role each of you maybe briefly played, where in your respective contributions to this ecosystem of change. So actually, let's start with you, Julie. How's that?
So as I mentioned earlier, this, as being the practitioner and the direct service provider, this is new to me. And it's really slow. So it's amazing how much persistence is required. And I was thinking, as if we're talking to practitioners mostly today, you know, how do you find room on your plate to do more than you're already doing, which is a ton. But the answer is in the partnership. So if hopefully there's some viable partnerships. So what my role has been, I think, is a lot of times I haven't been entirely successful, but we're able to find some of our students, our clients who have confronted this issue. And then a couple of them have been able to get into those meetings with legislators so they can, and it seems to have been really impactful once they can, you know, if you can get a meeting together. But as practitioners, the students are very reluctant. There's a lot of shame in this. But so if you can find and cultivate some relationships with the students going forward, it seems to be like a really important piece. So that's my piece of the work, I think.
I appreciate that. And of course, not to mention the fact that you kicked this all off, right? You of course identified a problem and then connected to policy matters. So your power in this, I know it's slow, but certainly you're the reason we're here on so many levels. So thank you. So Pete, you've talked about this a little bit, but related to how you how you select or how you help Julie think about who might come to the table to tell the best narrative.
Right. Well, first, I do want to also say that, working with College Now, working with Julie has just made, as somebody who does a lot of this kind of research, having a partner like a lot of the partners we have, but obviously starting with Julie and College Now, just has given this much more impact than we would have had otherwise. I mean, over the few months after we released that report, and we were going to go to Indianapolis to do a presentation somewhere, and that got canceled, of course, because of the pandemic. But we gave, I don't know how many, 8 or 9 Zoom presentations over the course of the first several months after the report came out. And I think that just gave us an opportunity to really keep the issue, front and center. And then I think through some of those is when Tom and I got to know each other. I don't know how we made that connection, but Tom and I haven't ever met in person, but we've been working together very closely over the past 6 months. And so this range, and there's other partners at the table as well. We have the Ohio Student Association. They're not here today, but they do student organizing on different campuses around the state, and the connection with them has helped drive this, and we've tapped into their voice on this as well. So I think it's just that, I hope I answered your question, but like that's
Yeah.
just this combined effort that really, I mean, Julie said it's going very slowly, but for me, this is, I'm not saying I won't say it's going quickly, but it's really moving, and it's very encouraging, and it's because of the broad partnerships and coalitions from, starting with College Now and Tom
Sure.
and the connections he brings to the table. It's all very much of what's making this gain traction.
So Thomas, we're bringing back on Malia and Juana. Why don't I let you have the last word about what it takes to really move the needle on this, and how and sort of what your big takeaway or learning or success has been.
So again, 2 things. One is I think the key is it's not just making contact with legislators, it's making contact with the right legislators, knowing where the right leverage points are. That's the first thing. And the second thing, in talking to legislators, we have tried to show them that we are trying to help students navigate toward a credential or degree at the lowest debt possible. And we have some websites that are now emerging in the state of Ohio that show high school students how to navigate to a credential or degree through multiple different institutions to secure the degree at the lowest debt possible. And that shows the legislators that we're not just trying to get rid of the debt problem. We're trying to be responsible stewards of the resources that we have, and help students appreciate that there are multiple ways to get a 4-year degree or a 2-year degree or a credential. And part of your obligation, our obligation, is to help them make responsible choices as they endeavor that journey toward a credential or degree.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Well, I'm so excited that we have now everybody together talk about a superstar panel. Boy, there's so many questions to ask. Before I turn to Kathy to tell us what's in the chat, because although I keep glancing, I can't really focus. I apparently can't do 2 things at once. I promised Kylie earlier that we would start with her question, which really is perfect, which is sort of the evolution of these pretty draconian practices that and what we think is behind them. I'd like to offer a theory and then let you guys all punch holes in that. And that is that nobody thought about the student, right? This was purely, there's a transaction, somebody owes money, and nobody thought about the student. But I'd like to maybe Malia or Juana, if one of you would like to just offer an observation, and then we'll take it around to the rest of you.
Sure, well, and Juana can jump in too, but I think, Sally, my response probably would have been about the same. That it said, developing these is indeed transactional, right? They have a business, institutions have a business to run, and that is that's their product, right? That transcript, that credential, is their product. And in order to be able to really make good use of it, that's their barter, right? So.
And I would add to it from the state policies that we did find, it was really clear that these state policies were written not with institutions even specifically in mind. So it wasn't that a bunch of folks were sitting around saying, what would be a really great practice for the institutions? I don't think they were asking that question about for the students. But in many cases, I'm just thinking about Georgia, for example, institutions are just kind of lumped in as any other state agency. And so really the law behind there is dealing with credit for the state and debt for all types of public agencies, not really specific to institutions of higher ed and what might be unique about their business model or their day-to-day work. So I really don't think that anyone was asking, is this what's right for the student?
That's interesting, right? So if I don't pay my taxes, the city of Philadelphia has the right to foreclose on my house, right? I mean, that's sort of, and they thought about it. That's very interesting. So then I'll put it to you, Tom, and then I'm going to go to Kathy for our audience questions. So what do you do with that? How do you tell the story or build the narrative that helps to separate institutions from sort of other sort of general organizations, and then help legislators put good practice into place?
Well, I think legislators want to see success stories, and so if they can see that this is happening with efficacy in some places, that helps them better begin to understand how they might implement it here in the state, or especially for the constituents that they serve. So I think if you can show them, look, this is actually a good model for Ohio. This is a good model for your district. This is a good model for your constituents, for the students, the young people, those all ages who are pursuing degrees and credentials. If they can see that efficacy, regardless of who's telling the story, in most cases, they'll try to figure out if there's a way in which that can be transitioned from practice to policy.
Thank you. Thank you. Kathy.
Yes. So a couple of questions actually have already been answered by the panel members, but there was one question from Taylor Dean that I thought was real interesting about where did these policies come from? I mean, who started it? Did it start in high school where we withheld, if students didn't pay for their books, they didn't get their diploma? Did it start in college and high schools took it over? So does anybody know the origin of all of this? Pete?
Well, I think Juana already kind of addressed it. I didn't want to repeat what she said, but what I've heard, I'm not sure how I came across this, but just like the idea that these are at this post-secondary level, these are public entities, and this is the AG's role is to collect the debt. Like this is what the AG does this for other public entities as well,
Right?
Not just for schools. They're just like, well, these are public entities. They're part of this mix, so this is the process. And there was law written, specifically relating to the schools as a certain kind of public entity, but they are essentially, with that, there is a bit of an different approach because of the student piece, but it's essentially, these are public entities. This is public money. We've got to collect it and keep our, because this is protecting public money. And I think, again, it's not student-centered. It's not even institution-centered. It's really about this transactional view of like, how does the system work and what do we do with public money? So, yeah.
So that's very helpful. Actually, Julie, I have a question. I have a question for you as really the peer to so many people who are on this call, right? It's not, I'm guessing, well, in my experience, it's not like institutions tell you about what they do. They don't say, hey, we're going to hold your transcript hostage in their marketing material. So, if you're a community and you're a practitioner working with adults, how might you even go about sort of collecting this information, and are institutions sort of open to providing it?
We found them to be when we started working with Cleveland State University first with those lists of students. We had a graduate assistant at the school and we were curious what other schools did. She just called the schools and they told her for the most part. And then similarly, Rebecca Weiss, I think, is on here. She had, I think, a similar experience. Once you can get a bursar on the phone, they'll pretty much tell you what they do. But the problem, the root cause in my mind is they are required to follow the law. I mean, you can toy around with it on the edges, but the vast majority of the systems are just set up to just zip that debt down to the AG's office. And no one even, I mean, I did see something in the chat that was like, why don't they warn the kids and blah, 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 blah. It's just like, when you have 17,000 students and so many thousand, you know, like everybody basically falls through the cracks. And then it's this whole ordeal to get the debt back. It's just, it's
right.
Yeah,
And
so-
you know, Malia, what did you want to
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on one thing that that Julie was mentioning, and it was a bit of the research that we had done, which is while in Ohio and some other states, it is a requirement, right? You basically have no choice at some point in time to then send that debt along to an AG or some other agency. That's not true for every state. So there is language in other states' laws that are much more permissive and say, you know, an institution or a system may do this. So it does behoove folks to look into what the language is within your state in order to really understand if that's a must. Has someone just interpreted it as a must, but it's not really. But just doing that digging to understand what those laws actually say. But in terms of, like, Julie, when you were saying some of the comments about how to ensure that the students know what those repercussions are, I think we really need to shift our thinking, right, around building on what Juana was saying earlier around who's really benefiting from this. And can we have institutions start working for students versus the other way around, right? And so while at the same time we need to be working in the here and now before policies change, so we want to make sure that students understand what those implications are, and that they're, make sure that they have access, easier access than what we necessarily found in doing our research. What is the benefit to the institution, right? Like, if keeping somebody from coming back actually keeps you as an institution from earning revenue, right? Above and beyond what that debt is that they do owe. So we're not necessarily saying that all debt has to be erased, but then, the logic behind not allowing someone to return to earn that degree, to be able to pay that back, as I just think we need to shift the thinking. Not how do we ensure students know how to navigate, but how do we ensure that institutions are actually setting up practices and policies that allow students to actually succeed.
Yeah.
Sally, one other thing I wanted to add, the work that HCM did on this, Leah and Juana and their team, was incredibly invaluable in ways that I did not anticipate at first. Specifically, in talking to legislators, a couple of them specifically wanted to know whether we knew what other states were doing.
Yeah.
It really helped when I was able to go, yes, we do. We have that. And we were able to share it, because lots of times people delay policy or practice decisions because they go, well, we need to know what others are doing before we can really make a thoughtful decision here. We sort of took that off the table and said, no, we've already got that. We can give that to you. So they did quality work. They did work that I think really helped move us several steps forward in our policy efforts.
That's great. I mean, it is. So I'm excited by a few of the models. The one that I always, that we hear about a lot, and it's because we do at the network, we have such great partners. Julie's peers in Detroit Drives Degrees. And so we know a lot about, or we've heard a lot about Warrior Way Back, which is the Wayne State program, which you called back out in your deck, and a lot of attention is being paid to that. I hear about it a lot as a progressive model that sort of re-examined and rethought at the institutional level this issue. What made them unique? I've got to believe, given there's like 45 states, right, that have this where the public institutions have this flexibility. Maybe my mouth is wrong, but there's like a big chunk of them where the institutions have this flexibility. What makes them so unique, and do we think that their approach is influencing other institutions? Anybody want to take that on?
I'm happy to start. I think it's a really great question. And I'll say, before coming to HCM, I was working at the regional level, also doing collective impact work, and might have been at the same conference Julie was at, hearing from our colleagues Dawn Medley at Warrior Way Back talk about the model. And what struck me in her framing of how they came up with it was simply asking, why are we doing things this way? And so in their state, in Michigan, there is no policy that is prescriptive on what institutions must do with outstanding debt. But yet again, institutions by and large are frequently referring that debt out to external collections and being really punitive with holding transcripts. What Dawn found out when she was asking her colleagues was that actually, if a student wasn't enrolling or returning in 3 years' time, as far as their bookkeeping was concerned, they were kind of writing off that debt. They didn't think that debt was going to be collectible, and they would move on. But yet they would hold on to that transcript, and they would, once the student did pop up 4 years down the road, 5 years down the road, they would say, actually, you have an unpaid debt here. And so she had to convince people on her campus that it would actually be more worthwhile to work with the student to pay down that debt over time, incrementally. And then they would actually be able to generate, new tuition revenue from that student's re-enrollment. So I think what they have done very effectively to influence other colleges and universities to consider debt forgiveness. Again, debt forgiveness sometimes is just an off-putting phrase for people, is they've had to demonstrate a positive ROI. And to show that from a dollars and cents perspective, it actually is in the institution's interest to consider an approach that will help students return, will help pay down that debt, and the money that gets invested in terms of that debt pay down actually ends up being paid back in spades. And I know Julie and Pete documented how this has actually played out in Ohio as well, at Lorain County College, at Cleveland State Reconnect program. These other pilots that are out there are also demonstrating a positive ROI. So I think that's going to be key for institutions to understand in order to be willing to innovate in that space.
Sure, which is a big lift, and probably not data, Julie, that you could have pulled together without the partnership with Pete, right?
We were calculating the ROI for a long time because we were doing this project with Cleveland State before we had debt forgiveness. So even if you don't have debt forgiveness, just helping students back, which is what all of us do, does pay off. Even if you don't have money to give them, a lot of times they just want some help.
Of course.
Kudos, everybody across the country.
Okay. So pretty much this is something that at least the beginning stuff, the stuff that Juana just talked about, are the kinds of ways that you could tell this story, or something that you've got at your fingertips. And certainly we've got tools that we're working on at the network for all of our programs to be able to use to try to calculate ROI, positive ROI. Hopefully between some of these models that we've talked about, including Warrior Way Back, and the work that you're able to calculate in terms of the return on investment, you can start to work with individual. So if you're in Texas, or you're in anywhere that, if you're not in Pennsylvania, Virginia, Ohio, What are the 5 states that with the really punitive laws, the AG laws? If you're not in those 5 states, right, you can at least start moving the needle, perhaps with not as big a lift as Julie's needed to take to eradicate this. But I'm wondering from a state level now, this is very optimistic. So if you have a state that begins with an M, so starting with Minnesota and Missouri, so Mississippi, Michigan, a few others. If you're an M state at least, and maybe we'll start working out on the other sides of the alphabet, there are very progressive strategies in place that actively now are addressing, helping, providing some incentives for students with debt to be able to go back. Is that's true? Do we want to spend a little bit of time on that and see what's going on and how we think that is influencing other states in terms of being the leaders in that? Thoughts on that? Malia, have you seen anything, or Pete in particular, from your national work?
I was just going to actually ask Juana whether or not you wanted to speak to it. I mean, from your point, Sally, in terms of if you're an M state, but we still need to work out to the rest of the alphabet on the direction, right. I think is a pretty good, pretty accurate statement, right? So the depth here is fairly shallow in the sort of state level approaches to this right now. I think the COVID shutdown at least provided an opportunity to, apply a new lens and see exactly, how challenging this was for students. And so there were some emergency programs put in place. But beyond that, I think we're talking about M states and, the other handful, California, Louisiana, and Washington, in terms of just the state level legislation that has been enacted. And beyond California, right, there's still even more improvements to the other legislation that we did mention. But Juana, did you want to pick up on that?
Sure. And coincidentally, Sally, it is an M state. So Minnesota actually right now in its current legislative session has a bill that the Office of Higher Education is sponsoring related to transcript withholding. So I think its bill and what happens this session will probably be consequential for other states, particularly Midwestern states. As a Californian, I'll be the first to acknowledge that sometimes even if California is first, it's not necessarily that influential because everyone thinks, oh, well, out there in California, of course, they're going to go do that, but that would never work here at home. Sure. So the state matters, which state is doing what. And to Malia's point around COVID response, I know that Julie and others have noted that at time the pace of change has felt very slow. I do want to acknowledge the past year was a really challenging year to get anything done legislatively that was not focused on COVID immediate response.
Right, of course.
And we did see, at least in New York, their Attorney General's office stopped collecting on past due debt from SUNY institutions temporarily during COVID. So not going all the way or as far as would probably be better for students, but at least in that using that COVID moment to connect the dots on some of these issues.
Thank you. I can't believe it, but we're almost at the end, so we're going to sort of move to wrap. I have a quick question for Julie, because I'd like to, we have a lot of communities, a lot of your peers are on this call. So very quickly, our community of practitioners, what advice would you give them for exercising leadership in taking on this issue in their communities?
Well, I mean, I feel like I'm being repetitive, but it's really finding the right partners. So again, the only reason I even knew about Policy Matters Ohio is because someone that worked for us went over there and I started talking to her about it. So I guess it's expand your network, see what's going on. It turns out there's tons of stuff going on already that you might be able to plug into. You don't have to recreate it. It's nice to hear strategy labs might still be an option if you want to fund some research. So that was super easy if you want to get a report written for you. But just see if you can carve out some time. I know everybody's really, really stretched, but this to me feels like a root cause of a barrier for our clients. And it's not easy to change, but I feel like it could be really influential in actually helping the residents of the state of Ohio.
Well, I so appreciate that. We're going to go to one last question because I started this by saying that we are an organization that's looking to catalyze action around the things that prevent us from achieving full educational equity. And we started LearnX seminars with this because this felt like one of the biggest issues confronted by our adult learners. We call them comebackers. And we want to make sure that you have an opportunity in front of lots of witnesses to give us some advice. So as a national network, what advice would you give us to help move the needle and to help our communities? And I'm going to start with Juana. Like 20 seconds.
Sorry, I wasn't ready with my mute button. I think just convening conversations such as these, helping communities hear from each other, identify their common challenges. And even in the chat, I'm seeing folks share new examples of debt forgiveness models that we didn't know were out there. So having an offline conversation of how you started those conversations, what it took to get the ball moving, I think would be really helpful. And as a national network, you're uniquely able to provide to your community leaders.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hey, Pete, how about you?
Yeah, I would just reiterate some of what we've been talking about, like the looking for partners, holding up some of these examples. I mean, the Wayback folks, Don Medley and others have come, been in rooms in Ohio on Zoom at least a couple times with just telling their story. And now we've got these statewide models that we're talking about. I think the more we can raise up what works and why it works and focus on students in new ways. And that ROI is really important. The more we can bring those ideas forward and get more people interested, these partnerships that we've got showing up right here really have made the difference. None of us could have done it on our own.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to go to Malia next. Before I do that, I'm going to ask Zach to drop the link to our session evaluation in the chat. Malia, tell us what your advice to us would be.
Great. Well, I think I would just echo what Juana and Pete has said, and then and just layering into that, right, assisting folks think about what's sort of the research that they should be doing in order to be able to communicate with those policymakers within their own states, right? Because it's very easy to say, but that's not us. How do you actually pull the numbers together to share your individual state stories and then share that across the network?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Tom.
I also concur. It's about knowing the role that you play and then knowing the role that others can play and then leveraging all those different efforts.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. And I would, of course, add to that you guys will be part of our village moving forward. And Julie, I want to end with you. Your advice to us as the Graduate Network.
Yeah, I'm not, this is not my world so much with policy. I know we've tried this somewhat in the past to have toolkits and so forth. And I guess you don't have to create them, but maybe just, connects us to things that have worked in projects. I know there have been some other policy pushes in other states that I heard about, and that's really helpful to understand what's possible.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are at time. Thank you, Julie, Peter, Malia, Juana, and Tom. We are so grateful to have you here with us today. It's been wonderful. Thank you, everybody who's here and has stuck with us for 90 minutes. We are so grateful for your being here, and also most importantly, for the work that you do every single day on behalf of educational equity and our nation's comebackers. Please fill out your evaluation. Our LearnX seminars need to be relevant, and we only get better if you tell us what we did well and what we should improve for next time. Thank you, Kathy Zandona, for making this happen, and Zach, our wonderful producer. I hope you all have a fabulous rest of the morning for those on the left coast. And for the rest of us, a wonderful afternoon and rest of the week. Thank you so much for being here. Bye-bye.